Hi there. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, for the uninitiated, was possibly the best known anti-communist name at some point, till the West quietly discarded him. A guy known for some kooky beliefs, near entirely fabricated stories passed off as historical fact, and a deeply xenophobic nationalism that made him the talk of the town for the enlightened liberal West. This isn't the tale of a hero. He's a monument to the West's desperation to promote anyone willing to oppose the USSR, no matter how strange or unsavory. So, who is he, and why was this guy first arrested? Class background is of course important. Born in 1918 to a family of rich landowners whose property was expropriated during the Russian Revolution, he lived a mostly uneventful life until World War II, where he was quite the unpleasant figure, mostly to Jewish people, according to even his own admirers. But in February 1945, during a war for the existence of the USSR, he criticized the war leadership and mused on overthrowing the Soviet government. To quote an incredibly sympathetic source to him, Solzhenitsyn and another officer, after days of discussion, astonishingly drew up a program for change entitled Resolution No. 1. They argued that the Soviet regime stifled economic development, literature, culture, and everyday life. A new organization was needed to fight to put things right. Some sources even state that he directly acted on it, but I can't get my hands on any of the letters he wrote, so I can't say that much exactly. He did, however, state, and I quote, "The German army could have liberated the Soviet Union from communism, but Hitler was too stupid and did not use this weapon." The weapon in question being counter-revolutionary organizations within the Soviet Union, which Nazi Germany did use, as they did in France. Solzhenitsyn treated the failure of Nazi Germany to annex the Soviet Union as some kind of missed opportunity. Later investigations, and through his own glowing testament in his books, Solzhenitsyn also turned out to be an admirer of Andrei Vlasov, a notorious Nazi collaborator. Now, what do you call a guy who sympathizes with Nazi Germany, supports their war aims, and idolizes Nazi collaborators? I'll leave that up to you. Anyways, this unsurprisingly led to his arrest and being sent to a labor camp. This isn't controversial. He would have been arrested no matter which country during wartime. This simple fact of him plotting to overthrow the Soviet government is always conveniently hidden under the claim that he was arrested for calling Stalin mean or some other nonsense. Let's briefly talk about some of his other work before getting to his masterpiece, the Gulag Archipelago, starting with his book One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. In it, Solzhenitsyn paints a picture of life inside the prison walls as more liberated than outside. Oh boy, what a caged little hero. Just don't bring any Jewish people around him. This silly narrative glosses over the historical and material realities of Soviet life, where, despite significant hardship, the Soviet Union made immense strides in education, healthcare, and economic development. Of course, it doesn't mean it's perfect, but this stuff should be considered. His focus on his individual suffering, though, how liberal of him, overshadows the collective efforts of a society that made and was making immense developments, especially compared to what came before it. In his other work titled Cancer Ward, his character expresses a cynical liberal refrain that greed and corruption are immutable human traits, which totally abandons the possibility of societal change and ignores the actual sociological fact that people are products of and subject to their material conditions. Nobody is immutably anything. This is also the work based on his time in a prison camp where he was cured of his cancer, free of charge, by the Soviet healthcare system in a gulag. Non-imprisoned Americans can't even give birth in a hospital without financially ruining themselves, let alone get cancer treatment. You can't reconcile the evil, mean, bad police state is crushing us all with even his own sense of reality and what he experienced. Solzhenitsyn's writings, including the Gulag Archipelago, strip away any pretense of complexity, presenting the Soviet regime as cartoonishly or unreasonably evil. There's no effort to analyze why things happened. Back to the video in just a minute. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Incogni. A little while back, a massive data breach involving the National Public Data Company exposed tons of personal information of millions of people to the public, including their social security numbers. NPD is a data aggregator that collects information from various sources without your knowledge or consent, which allows for massive breaches like this to happen should hackers be determined enough. This information being online for all to see exposes you to various dangers such as scams, identity theft, online harassment, and stalking. Data breaches can leak your name, social security number, login credentials, home address, location history, online activity, and more. Many data brokers sell this bulk data to companies, which may use it to target vulnerable and disadvantaged groups, to increase insurance rates, or other unpleasantries. Now, what can you do about this? Well, that's simple. You can use Incogni. Incogni contacts data brokers on your behalf, requests the removal of your personal data, and handles any objections they might have. Through an automated process, Incogni ensures your data stays off the market by making repeated removal requests. That's why Incogni's annual subscription is so valuable. It continuously protects your data privacy for as long as you're subscribed. For my viewers, you can get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan using the link below or with my code HAKIM. How do you get started? First, create an account, grant Incogni the right to work for you by contacting data brokers on your behalf, and kick back as Incogni requests your personal data removal. handles any objections from data brokers, and keeps you updated on their progress every step of the way. So what are you waiting for? Click my link in the description, use the code Hakim, and get your 60% off an annual Incognito plan and start protecting your data today. Thanks to Incognito for the sponsorship. This allows me to pay my editor fairly, which is much appreciated. Alright, back to the video. Let's move on to his supposed masterpiece, the Gulag Archipelago. The Gulag Archipelago is considered a crown jewel of anti-communist work, up there with the Black Book of Communism, which adds Nazi dead on the Eastern Front as victims of communism, so yeah, that's the level of reliable we're talking here. On that note, check out my video on the topic here. Anyways, the Gulag Archipelago is supposed to be an attack laying bare the terrible truth of the Soviet labor camp system. A system of rehabilitation through labor used throughout the world, including the West, up until the 1950s, when the USSR stopped using it as well. This system, however, is still used in other forms to this day in the United States through the existence of penal labor. Here's the catch in regards to Solzhenitsyn's book, though. It's based entirely on unverifiable anecdotes, wild exaggerations, and flimsy evidence. In essence, they're camp stories. Even his wife said so, stating, "The subject of the Gulag Archipelago is not in fact the life of the country, and not even the life of the camps, but the folklore of the camps." J.R. Getty, a celebrated historian and expert in the field, said his documentation is methodologically unacceptable in other fields of history, and that the work is of limited value, which is a nice way of saying it's bullshit. Solzhenitsyn wasn't content on just describing the Gulag system. He took pains to twist and stretch meanings and words to paint the USSR as an evil monster from 1917 until its fall. And because all of it was pure propaganda, it was made to reach you at an emotional level, so you ignore the fact that he's talking nonsense. Yet many still treat this borderline fictional memoir as a history book. Historians who have studied this work consider it a memoir, not a historical document. Gulag memoirs, like Solzhenitsyn's, offers no such documentation and provide readers no way to verify his claims. It's because memoirs and adjacent literature focus almost entirely on individual experiences, meaning stories, anecdotes, all of which are highly unreliable sources. Now, this doesn't mean that gulags were good or whatever you may have dreamt up, but an honest person approaches topics like this with nuance and evidence, something almost entirely missing from this work. Gulags existed, they weren't nice places to be. On the other hand, both by total amount of people and by percentage, the US prison industrial system is larger than the Gulag system at its peak. So why isn't the US considered an empire of evil? This is the kind of contextualization you need to actually understand things, but I'm getting carried away. Read Getty's work. The USSR's secrecy regarding the Gulag system was nearly airtight, so basic facts like how many people were in the Gulag were left to wild speculation, which unfortunately ended up serving Solzhenitsyn's interests since it meant he could lie wildly. Even the scraps of data historians were left with were often unreliable, since they came from highly questionable sources. Solzhenitsyn tells horror stories from inside the camps, but never develops an analysis of why gulags exist or why he's interned, aside from generic authoritarian for authoritarian's sake nonsense. Why would he? The goal of his work isn't to provide a well-substantiated, accurate, and nuanced picture of the Gulag, or mention how the majority of his fellow inmates were embezzlers, corrupt officials, ethno-nationalists, rapists, violent criminals, etc., and not all gentle, songbird political criminals, even according to the most anti-communist of sources. One perfect example of his dedication to creating anti-Soviet propaganda is his wildly exaggerated death toll numbers. As we all know, anti-communist propaganda loves inflating death tolls. Solzhenitsyn's claims of millions of dead in the camps are absurd. But he wasn't alone. Robert Conquest, an intelligence officer employed in a dedicated anti-communist propaganda bureau, claimed that the Kolyma camps alone killed 3 million people, a number he pulled out of his ass and is literally mathematically impossible. He's essentially the popularizer of the vast majority of anti-Soviet myths, which he frequently did based on no evidence and in a way that wouldn't fly for any other historical research had it been not so ideologically convenient. So what is the truth? Well, the answer is simple. There was no mass death or extermination policy in the prison system. In fact, the central government, sadly not always in the know of all the conditions in every single prison in the massive country, pushed for better medical care and quickly punished Gulag officials if death rates spiked. And yes, people did tragically die after being released, and that is a valid criticism, but the outrageous numbers Solzhenitsyn and others throw around are childish. When conditions in the camps got bad, the Soviets released the worst-off prisoners early. Solzhenitsyn's logic is that, well, technically all the prisoners that were released eventually did die of something, so therefore the Gulag system killed them, which leads him to
figures up to 66 million.
However, scholars today have real data and a more accurate death toll, estimating a tiny fraction of what Solzhenitsyn claimed between 1930 and 1950, the most turbulent period of the country since the Civil War. Thanks to this serious archival research, we can now properly grapple with the actual grim reality of the Gulag and rightfully criticize it. It was horrific, but it wasn't the Nazi-style death camp Solzhenitsyn and his followers portrayed it as. This exaggerated, one-sided account of Soviet labor camps continued to shape Western perceptions of the USSR due in large part to the CIA. This shouldn't be understated. Most of what you know about the USSR is probably the brainchild of directed, nefarious propaganda work by what essentially amounts to a terrorist organization that overthrows democratic governments for fruit company profits. The only reason Solzhenitsyn is known, and that people at least pretend to have read the Gulag Archipelago or his other works, is because the CIA plastered it everywhere, pretty much like Orwell with Animal Farm in 1984. The CIA treated the Gulag Archipelago like a holy book, using it as a tool in their crusade against the Soviet Union and promoting it in a propaganda operation in Europe aimed at influencing people in hating socialism and glorifying the American way of life. One of their most potent weapons was a front organization that funded and promoted anti-Soviet propaganda called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. They translated the Gulag Archipelago into many languages almost immediately and promoted it and the lies within alongside with his other works. This wasn't some minor operation. On the surface, the CCF appeared to be funded by labor unions, but even most of its members were clueless about where the money was really coming from. The CIA would rope in prominent Western intellectuals like Arthur Koestler and Ignacio Salone to lend credibility to their cause. They published and heavily promoted books, organized conferences, handed out awards, all in the relentless pursuit of winning the culture front of the Cold War. Almost no post-war intellectual in Europe was untouched by the CIA's influence, whether they realized it or not. A relevant book on the topic is Who Paid the Piper? The CIA and the Cultural Cold War. So if Solzhenitsyn's work was mostly political musings and camp fairy tales, co-opted for propaganda purposes, what was the man behind the fairy tales like? After all, he was the liberal darling for decades. Well, Solzhenitsyn wasn't subtle in his rejection of democracy, to begin with. For him, democracy wasn't just impractical for Russia, it was dangerous. He argued that Western-style freedoms would lead to ethnic conflict and instability, and pushed for, and I'm not kidding, a Russia-first policy, like a proto-Trump. Solzhenitsyn believed that because Russians had suffered more than any other people, particularly in relation to World War II, that they should prioritize their national welfare above all else, even at the expense of global cooperation. He viewed the fight for political freedoms, like voting rights, as distractions from the real battle against falsehoods, particularly what he called the big lie. I promise this esoteric-ass way of describing things is real. He thought they pulled attention away from the moral struggle, which he saw as more important. Democracy to him was moral relativism, and therefore lacked firm leadership and a strong moral compass to guide society. This strong moral compass for him was actually just Russian orthodoxy, which he thought could offer the stability democracy lacked. This leads Solzhenitsyn to argue that Russian authoritarianism, specifically of the Tsarist variety, wasn't all that bad actually, because at least it preserved moral order. This is ignoring that Tsarist law, particularly in the latter period, was secularized and based on the same relativism he condemned. Besides the moral compass pillar, his other major reason for rejecting democracy was that monarchy, and its brand of authoritarian rule, has been the historical norm and as such should be the norm forever. The best argument, of course. We've always done this, so let's continue doing this. In contrast, he viewed democracy as a fad that would quickly flare up and die out. He was the model arch-conservative, basically a monarchist. I'm reminding you, this guy was a liberal darling. To him, serfdom was a golden age representing a time when divine and temporal authority were in harmony, nostalgia for a time generations behind him and one that he never experienced. His ideal, a strict and arbitrary, hierarchical, authoritarian society rooted in traditional values, was essentially feudalism. To him, the fall of Tsar Nicholas II and the end of autocratic rule was the beginning of Russia's moral decline. He hated egalitarianism, arguing that because everyone is good at different things, we can't have an egalitarian society, which is possibly the stupidest gripe you could have with the idea. This rejection of equality, unlike his relationship with Christian aesthetics and monarchy, was very much in line with his fashy fetish for order and conformity. This is as deep as he philosophized, though. The how, what, and why, any sort of deeper political analysis, all of it is basically absent. All that was left, in reality, was apologism and admiration for Pinochet's Chile, Salazar's Portugal, and Franco's Spain. What a convenient set of pals for an anti-communist crusader. Solzhenitsyn was anti-Semitic too, to no one's surprise. And I don't mean, oh, he's anti-Semitic as a result of absorbing it from the background of a racist culture. No, he was one of those anti-Semites, the kind of guy that would be comfortable talking about how the Jews control the world, unironically, to a stranger at a party. This wasn't a minor flaw, it was a central pillar of his later work. As an example, in his book 200 Years Together, he didn't critique Bolshevism, he just blamed the Jews for the revolution and all of Russia's prior and subsequent ills. In a 1974 letter to Soviet leaders, he even suggested that minority groups, especially Jews, should leave the USSR to save the Russian people and maintain Russia essentially as an ethnostate. This sentiment is what got him expelled from the USSR in 1974, following earlier support from Nikita Khrushchev's government to publish his works. Some dissident he was. Fred Hampton was brutally murdered in his bed by state-delivered assassins, but this guy got government support for his writing. He blamed Jews for their own persecution, attempted to connect Jews to Bolshevik commissars, and echoed the rhetoric of the Black Hundreds, the ultranationalist anti-Jewish groups from Tsarist Russia. This Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy theory, that Jews created communism to control the world, is a Nazi idea that is still with us today, in its renamed form, cultural Marxism. Must be why Jordan Peterson wrote the foreword for the latest edition of the Gulag Archipelago, Reactionaries of a Feather. In the West, however, Solzhenitsyn's nationalism and racism were hidden and or overlooked by his liberal admirers, of which he had many, who were salivating at the opportunity to embrace absolutely anyone from the USSR critical of the Soviet Union, even a lying monarchist anti-Semite. A relevant side note, he was the only writer from the Soviet Union to pass apartheid's South Africa's racist and anti-communist censorship exam, and never once in his life uttered a word about apartheid. Some crusader for freedom. Solzhenitsyn's critiques of the Soviet system and Western liberalism were neither insightful or revolutionary. He vacillates between reactionary dreams of a romanticized past and his total failure to understand material history. His disdain for both systems was rooted in a fascist and monarchist desire to return to an era that never existed. Solzhenitsyn said Western culture had become cowardly and morally bankrupt while propping up himself as a moral authority, of course as any monarchist would. Individual rights in the West, he believed, actually weakened administrative power. In his view, society's problem wasn't the exploitation of the many by capitalists, but the lack of a strong and moral authority capable of enforcing its will on the masses. He said the West had too much comfort and that it was a biological disadvantage to have that much comfort. This was really just a call for austerity, which reactionaries love. His strange historical musings pin blame on the Renaissance as the historical turning point, where spiritual values were replaced by materialism, leading to the eventual fall of monarchy. If you read between the lines, he's actually identifying and personally finding issue with the kernels of capitalism, and the eventual march of the ideology of liberal governance as a guarantee for capital and capitalist development. But he's too fucking stupid to reach the correct conclusion that this is the march of history due to developing productive forces, and just as monarchy and feudalism was superseded, so will capitalism. He instead falls back on advocating for a fantasy past with serfs and kings. He was absolutely convinced that the peasantry was the moral backbone of society, essentially just advocating for feudalism. Here's an interesting example that I'm betting you won't guess. He was highly critical of the rise of capitalist speculators. No, it wasn't a critique of capitalism itself. Instead, he criticized them because they were a symptom of the collapse of his beloved Russian autocracy. More people with wealth means less power for the king, or whatever strong moral ruler he thought up. He further argued that democracy was flawed because no king, essentially. He thought that if you're going to hold elections, they should focus on the moral authority of individual leaders rather than which political party or policies they represent. He doesn't seem to understand he's just putting different labels on a party system, the very thing he's trying to argue against, the critique of democracy. This critique of democracy implies, by his own logic, that the masses and peasants are simultaneously the unquestionable moral backbone of society, but that they're also incapable of self-governance and need to be led by a king or king-like figure. In the end, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's legacy is a sham built on contradictions and Cold War opportunism. He's celebrated as a champion for freedom, but pined for authoritarianism and promoted fascist views. His so-called masterpiece, the Gulag Archipelago, is riddled with exaggerations and inaccuracies. The Western ruling classes didn't embrace him for his contributions to justice. They needed a puppet, no matter how flawed, so they could push incoherent anti-Soviet propaganda. The second the USSR was no more, he became problematic and was quickly quieted. Solzhenitsyn should be remembered for being and promoting a reactionary, xenophobic vision. His celebrated status isn't just undeserved, it's a testament to the power of propaganda. There are better critics of the USSR, and you shouldn't have to resort to monarchist anti-Semites to rightfully criticize the Gulag system or the shortcomings of the USSR. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon, it really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you too. Nitro Dubs, Kenny, Thomas Roberts, Nicholas, Owen Baker, T. Wood, Dr. Lemonman, Lumix, Charlie and Eric, Ultimate Turin, Daniel Ethel, The Generic Guy, Santiago Pereira, Rain, Cassandra Corvus, David Fries, Confuse M, Mariana Mastusovic, Robbie Richardson, and Masay Kadro. Thanks for watching.